In court, my wife mocked me, couldn't even afford a lawyer. Until the judge looked at the evidence. She called it in the hallway during the lunch recess, right outside the courtroom, with her attorney standing behind her. Couldn't even afford a real lawyer? The words were quiet, almost kind, the way she always delivered things she meant to wound. 40 minutes later, Judge Whitmore used the phrase willful financial concealment. Jenny walked out of that courtroom with 40%. I walked out with 60, the LLC assets, and a repayment order she never saw coming. Viewers, before we continue, please subscribe, like and share. My name is James Boehm. I'm 41 years old, a structural engineer based in Columbus, Ohio, and if you'd asked anyone who knew me to describe my life 18 months ago, they would have used words like stable, quiet, predictable. I drove a used F-150 with a dent above the rear wheel well that I never got fixed. I kept a vegetable garden in the backyard that produced more zucchini than 2 people could ever eat. I coached a youth soccer team on Saturday mornings, not because I was especially passionate about soccer, but because it gave me something uncomplicated to care about. On paper, I was a man who had figured things out. 14 years of marriage to Jenny James, a house in Clintonville, a career I'd spent 2 decades building from drafting tables to project management. People envied what they thought they saw. Here's what they didn't see. They didn't see Jenny locking her phone screen the moment I walked into a room. They didn't see the way she'd started taking calls in the garage, voice low, door pulled almost shut. They didn't see the small, careful distance that had been growing between us for over a year, the way a hairline fracture travels through concrete, invisible until the structure fails. I'm a structural engineer. I know what ignored stress does to a load-bearing wall. I just didn't want to apply that knowledge to my own marriage. But here's what I've learned about quiet men who get underestimated. The world assumes we're not watching. The world assumes that because we don't raise our voices, we aren't paying attention. Jenny made that assumption. Her attorney made it. Half the courtroom made it. They were wrong. This is the story of how I found out my wife had been building a financial exit behind my back for years, how I discovered the affair that ran alongside it, and how I walked into a courtroom that was supposed to humiliate me and walked out with 60% of everything. I'll start at the beginning. The kitchen at 6:42 a.m. looked the same as it always did. Winter light coming through the frosted window above the sink, pale and flat. The coffee maker running its cycle, filling the room with that familiar smell that used to feel like comfort. I was in my work clothes already, boots, canvas pants, the navy thermal I wore under my jacket most of December through February. I was reaching past the kitchen island for my thermos when I saw it. Jenny's laptop was open. In 14 years, that woman had never left her screen unlocked when she stepped away from a room. Never once. It was a habit so consistent I'd noticed it years ago and filed it away as just one of her quirks, the same way she always checked the stove twice before leaving the house, the same way she folded towels in thirds instead of halves. But that morning, the screen was live, and an email thread was sitting open on it, and I wasn't snooping, I was just reaching for my thermos. I caught 3 lines before I stopped reading. A name I recognized. A hotel in Pittsburgh. A date from 6 weeks prior, a weekend she'd told me she spent visiting her mother in Cincinnati. I set the thermos down on the counter. Carefully. The way you set something down when your hands have gone slightly numb. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, that familiar rhythm, her left foot always landing slightly harder than her right. 30 seconds, maybe less. I stepped back from the island, picked up my thermos again, and turned toward the coffee maker. By the time she walked in, still in her robe, hair loose, I was pouring. Her eyes went to the laptop. Just for a fraction of a second. A flicker, almost nothing. "Morning," she said. "Morning," I said back. I drove to work in silence. Didn't call anyone. Didn't turn on the radio. Just sat with it, the way you sit with a diagnosis you already suspected but weren't ready to hear confirmed. Somewhere around the I-71 interchange, I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a business card I'd been carrying for 2 months. I stared at it the rest of the drive. I sat in the parking lot of my firm for 23 minutes with the engine running. The business card was white, minimal, no logo. Just a name, a number, and 2 words, Private Investigations. Phil Garner, retired Columbus PD, referred to me 4 months earlier by a colleague named Ray who was going through his own divorce and recognized something in my eyes at a project meeting that I hadn't yet admitted to myself. He'd slid the card across the table without making a thing of it. "You probably don't need it," he said. "But keep it." I'd almost thrown it away 3 times. Once into the kitchen trash, once into my desk drawer's back corner, once into a gas station bin on a Thursday night when I'd convinced myself I was being paranoid. I dialed before I could talk myself out of it again. Phil picked up on the second ring. His voice was flat and professional, the voice of a man who had heard every version of this conversation and didn't need the emotional preamble. I appreciated that more than I can explain. "I need to know if my wife is seeing someone," I said. "No build-up. No softening. How long have you suspected?" I looked through the windshield at the gray Columbus morning. "Longer than I've admitted to myself." He asked me 3 questions. Her general weekly schedule. The make and color of her car. Whether we had any joint bank accounts. Then he said, "Give me 10 days," and hung up. I sat there another 10 minutes after that. The coffee in my thermos had gone lukewarm. A calendar reminder buzzed on my phone, anniversary dinner reservation, Lindy's, 7 p.m., 3 weeks out. I'd made it back in October when things felt salvageable, or maybe when I was still pretending they did. I stared at it for a long time. Then I canceled it, slipped my phone into my pocket, and walked into the office. I didn't explode. I never explode. I plan. I measure twice, I cut once, and I make sure the structure holds before I put any weight on it. That morning, I started measuring. Phil called me back in 6 days, not 10. But before he did, I'd already started pulling threads on my own, and what I found sitting alone in my home office on a Tuesday night under a single desk lamp changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about my marriage. Jenny had always handled our household finances. I'd agreed to the arrangement early on because she was meticulous and I was busy, and frankly because she'd made the offer with such calm confidence that declining felt like an accusation. 14 years later, I was staring at bank statements I'd had to request directly from the institution because I'd never once logged into the joint account portal myself. I'd trusted her that completely. There was a second checking account I didn't know existed. 14 months of small outbound transfers, each one modest enough to avoid triggering any alert, collectively adding up to $34,000. The account was tied to an email address I'd never seen, registered under a variation of her name she hadn't used since before we married. Then there was the LLC. Filed in Delaware 3 years ago, listed under her maiden name. I only found it because Phil had mentioned during a brief check-in call that she'd been seen entering a commercial property on the east side of Columbus twice monthly. I searched the address. The LLC came up as a registered tenant. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. This wasn't just an affair. This was infrastructure. She had been quietly, methodically building a financial exit while I was coaching youth soccer and fixing drainage plans and growing zucchini I couldn't give away fast enough. Jenny's parents had divorced when she was 12. Her father had controlled every account, every asset, every financial decision, and her mother had walked away with almost nothing. Jenny had talked about that story across our entire marriage, always with the same quiet ferocity: "I will never be financially dependent on anyone." I'd respected it. I'd believed it was strength. She had taken that lesson and inverted it completely. She hadn't avoided control. She just made sure she was the one holding it. Phil's full report arrived as an encrypted file attachment on a Thursday afternoon. I opened it in my car, parked outside a coffee shop on Broad Street, engine off, gray sky pressing down on the city like a lid. I need to tell you that I prepared myself before I clicked. I told myself I was ready. I was not ready. His name was Craig Fulton. Mid-40s, commercial real estate development, recently separated from his own wife. I knew him, which was the part that sat in my chest like a stone. We'd met twice at industry events, shaken hands, exchanged the kind of surface-level professional pleasantries that mean nothing and apparently meant nothing to him either. He and Jenny had reconnected at a conference in Cleveland 14 months ago, right around the time she'd started locking her phone screen with a new urgency. Phil's documentation was thorough and impersonal, which somehow made it worse. Hotel receipts from Pittsburgh, Lexington, and once, Cincinnati. The same Cincinnati where Jenny had supposedly spent a weekend visiting her mother. 42 logged calls from a number stored in Jenny's phone under the name Dr. Renner, her supposed new gynecologist. 4 overnight trips. A pattern so consistent it had its own rhythm. There were photographs. I won't describe them in detail. What I will tell you is that Phil had included a handwritten note at the bottom of his printed summary, something he apparently did when he felt a client needed more than data. It said, she knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't impulsive. I closed the laptop. Sat there until the coffee shop windows fogged over from the cold outside. When I got home, Jenny was at the kitchen table, scrolling her phone, a glass of white wine at her elbow. Perfectly relaxed. Perfectly ordinary. Good day, she asked. Productive, I said. I changed clothes and watched a basketball game beside her on the couch and did not say a single word about any of it, because I needed 2 more weeks, and I was going to take them. Carol Weston's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown that had good bones and modest finishes, the kind of space that communicated competence without performing it. She was in her mid-50s, silver-haired, reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she had the specific stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where other people were falling apart and had learned to be the fixed point in those rooms. Her nameplate said Carol Weston, ESQ. The wall behind her held no trophy certificates, no framed news articles. Just a whiteboard covered in case notations and a single framed photograph of 2 dogs. I'd found her by researching every high-asset divorce ruling in Franklin County over the past 5 years. I'd built a spreadsheet. Carol had the best outcomes in cases involving financial concealment. I called her directly. What Jenny didn't know, what she'd stopped paying attention to somewhere along the way, was a decision I'd made 11 years earlier and never discussed. My grandfather had passed and left me $280,000. Rather than spend it or fold it into our joint life, I'd quietly invested it across 3 separate brokerage accounts held solely in my name, all opened before our marriage. Jenny knew the inheritance had existed. She assumed it was long gone, absorbed into the house renovation and a truck replacement. It was not gone. Over 11 years of compounding, it had grown to just over $1.1 million. Carol reviewed Phil's report, the bank statements, and the LLC filing across 45 minutes without interrupting me once. Then she set everything down and looked at me over her glasses. She moved $34,000 in the 18 months before initiating any divorce conversation. She hasn't initiated anything yet, I said. Carol nodded slowly. She's waiting for the right moment. Probably until she's moved enough out of reach. She slid a document across the desk. We file Monday. By Tuesday, every joint account is frozen. I picked it up and read it carefully. For the first time in weeks, something close to calm settled over me. I had rehearsed the conversation approximately 30 times. In the car. In the shower. Walking the perimeter of the backyard at night with my hands in my pockets while the dog nosed around the fence line. I'd rehearsed the words, the tone, the exact amount of stillness I wanted to maintain. Not coldness. Stillness. There's a difference, and I needed to know which one I was capable of when the moment came. I came home on a Monday evening to find Jenny on the couch with a glass of wine, exactly as she'd been the night I'd read Phil's report. The television was on. She looked comfortable and entirely unsuspecting, and I stood in the doorway for a moment just taking that in, the last ordinary image of what our life had looked like from the outside. I sat down across from her. Turned off the television with the remote. She looked up. I placed Phil's report on the coffee table, folded open to the Pittsburgh documentation, and sat back and waited. The silence lasted 11 seconds. "James, I can explain." "You don't need to," I said. "I'm not asking for an explanation. I'm telling you that I've retained an attorney, that I filed for divorce this morning, and that as of 9 a.m. today, our joint accounts are frozen pending full asset disclosure." I watched her face move through 4 expressions in the span of 2 seconds. Shock. Recalculation. Then something cold and very deliberate settling in behind her eyes. "You can't afford to fight this," she said, and her voice had gone almost gentle, "the way you deliver bad news to someone you'd already decided couldn't handle the full version. I have an attorney. You've never dealt with anything like this." I stood up and picked up my jacket. "I know you have an attorney," I said. "Raymond Aldrich. He charges $380 an hour. His last 3 high-asset cases settled in favor of the initiating party." I looked at her once more. I did my homework. I went upstairs. Behind me, I heard her reach for her phone. The 2 months that followed were the most methodical of my life, and I say that as a man who once spent 11 weeks stress-testing the load calculations on a pedestrian bridge over the Scioto River. Carol ran the legal process with the same quiet aggression she brought to everything: subpoenas, document production requests, forensic accounting referrals, and Raymond Aldrich spent most of those 2 months reacting instead of leading, which Carol told me was exactly where she wanted him. The forensic accountant was a woman named Dr. Sylvia Park, compact and precise, who spoke about financial irregularities the way a surgeon describes what she found during an operation: clinical, unhurried, certain. She sat across from me in Carol's conference room 3 weeks into discovery and walked me through what she'd found in the LLC's records with a highlighter and a printed ledger, and what she found was worse than I'd expected. Jenny had been billing consulting fees through the Delaware LLC to a development company where Craig Fulton held an advisory board position. The amounts were structured carefully, defensible individually, but in aggregate they formed a direct financial thread between my wife and the man she'd been seeing for over a year. It wasn't technically fraud. It was something more frustrating than fraud: it was architecture. Deliberate, plausibly deniable architecture. Aldrich fought every disclosure request. There were 3 separate hearings on document production alone, and at each one he arrived polished and confident, treating Carol like an obstacle he hadn't yet bothered to take seriously. He made a comment in the courthouse hallway after the second hearing that reached me through Carol, something about how I looked like I was there to give a home repair estimate. Carol told me this with a small, contained smile. "Good," she said. "Let them keep thinking that." Then came the phone call that changed everything. Carol, mid-session, listened for 90 seconds and made one note. She set her phone down and looked at me steadily. "Jenny just disclosed the Delaware account," she said. "But she listed the wrong origination date. She's off by 14 months. I leaned forward. "She just handed us the entire case." The Franklin County Common Pleas courtroom had the specific atmosphere of a room that had absorbed decades of human consequence: wood paneling worn smooth, fluorescent lighting that flattened everything into equal, merciless clarity, rows of hard benches behind the bar where a handful of observers sat with the detached patience of people waiting for something they didn't fully understand. I arrived early. I sat at the plaintiff's table in my navy blazer and I arranged my notes and I waited. Jenny came through the doors at 8:58 with Raymond Aldrich at her shoulder, and she was dressed for a different version of this day. Fitted gray suit, hair pulled back, the particular composure of a woman who had already decided how the story ended. She glanced at my side of the table once when she sat down, and I caught the flicker, a brief, dismissive read of Carol that telegraphed everything. Silver-haired woman in her 50s. No courtroom theater. No aggressive posture. Nothing that looked like a threat. Before the judge entered, Aldrich leaned across the aisle toward Carol, voice low, professional. "We're prepared to discuss a settlement structure. Reasonable and clean." Carol didn't look up from her notes. "We'll see you inside." What Jenny's team had not researched, and what Carol had requested specifically, was the assignment of the Honorable Sandra Whitmore. 19 years on the Franklin County bench. A documented, consistent, publicly available record of ruling against financial concealment in marital cases, 3 high-profile decisions in the past decade that had all held on appeal. The kind of judge who read forensic accounting supplements the way other people read novels, carefully, completely, with nothing missed. Judge Whitmore entered. The room stood. She sat, opened the case file, reviewed the top page, and said without looking up, "I see we have a forensic accounting supplement to the asset disclosure. Counselor Weston, you'll present first." Aldrich shifted in his seat. Beside him, Jenny went very still. The morning session did not go the way Jenny had planned, and I could see her recalibrating in real time from across the courtroom. Dr. Sylvia Park testified for 90 minutes. She walked Judge Whitmore through the 14 months of transfers, the LLC structure, the billing relationship with Craig Fulton's development company, and the misdated disclosure with the kind of methodical clarity that left almost no interpretive room. Judge Whitmore asked Aldrich 4 direct questions during the testimony. He answered 2 cleanly. The other 2 he deflected with procedural language that satisfied no one, least of all the judge, whose expression didn't change but whose pen stopped moving the moment he started talking. At the lunch recess I was standing near the water fountain in the courthouse hallway, jacket on, notes tucked under my arm, when Jenny approached. Aldrich trailed a few steps behind her, already checking his phone. She moved toward me with the specific body language of a woman delivering terms, chin level, pace unhurried, and she stopped about 4 feet away. The marble floors carried every sound. A distant door closing. Someone's heels down a far corridor. "James." Her voice had that same quality from the night I'd told her about the filing, almost kind, almost concerned, as though I were the one who needed managing. "I don't know what she told you she could accomplish, but this is going to get very expensive. You really couldn't even afford a real lawyer?" Her eyes moved briefly past my shoulder to where Carol was walking toward us from the far end of the hallway, coffee cup in hand. "It's not too late to settle. Cleanly. Take the house equity and we're done." I held her gaze for a moment. "Carol," I said. Carol reached us without slowing down. "Judge Whitmore reconvenes in 40 minutes. I want to review the accounting exhibits before we go back in." She walked straight past Jenny without a glance, without a pause, without any acknowledgement that Jenny was standing there at all. I followed. At the courtroom door, a court clerk found me quietly and handed me an envelope. Additional exhibit, cleared from the financial institution that morning. Carol opened it. Her eyebrows lifted, barely, briefly. "This changes the afternoon," she said. The additional exhibit was a wire transfer confirmation, subpoenaed weeks earlier and only just cleared through the institution's compliance process. It documented $11,400 moving from the Delaware LLC into a joint savings account 4 days before Jenny had submitted that account's balance in her initial asset disclosure, and then out of the joint account again 2 days later, before the freeze could capture it. Individually, you could construct an innocent explanation for the timing. But Judge Whitmore was not looking at it individually. She was looking at it as the final piece of a pattern that now had a beginning, a middle, and an unmistakable shape. The ruling came at 2:47 p.m. I remember the light in the room had shifted, afternoon sun cutting through the high windows at a low angle, catching the dust in the air above the gallery. Judge Whitmore read from her notes in the same measured, unhurried voice she'd used all day, and when she reached the phrase willful financial concealment inconsistent with good faith asset disclosure, I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding for months. Jenny received 40% of the marital assets. I received 60%. The Delaware LLC's assets were folded into the marital estate. She was ordered to repay the $34,000 in pre-separation transfers as an advance against her share. Aldrich requested a recess after the ruling was read. Judge Whitmore granted 5 minutes. He didn't look at me. Jenny didn't look at me. Carol put her hand briefly near mine on the table. Not quite touching. Just present. You stayed patient, she said quietly. That's what won this. I sold the Clintonville house 8 months later and moved into a smaller place near Grandview with a shepherd mix I'd adopted the week after the filing. I kept working. I kept building things. Jenny moved to Pittsburgh. Craig Fulton, from what reached me secondhand, ended things not long after the ruling became public record. I can't say I was surprised. Structures built on concealment have load-bearing problems that surface eventually. People ask if I'm bitter. I'm not. I'm careful. More careful than before, and more honest with myself about what I'd chosen not to inspect. I'm a structural engineer. I know you don't wait for the crack to show. You check the beam before it fails. What I haven't told you yet is what Carol found buried in the LLC's client list, 3 other names I recognized. One of them connected to something that reached well beyond a divorce case in Columbus, Ohio. That story is coming.